Hello, and welcome to the second installment of my series on Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. In this installment, I'll be discussing the prefaces to Decline of the West. First, the preface from 1926 by Charles Francis Atkinson, the English translator. Next, I'll discuss the 1922 preface to the revised edition that Spengler wrote. And then I'll discuss the first edition and the very brief preface that Spengler wrote for that at the very end of 1917. And to begin this, I'll start with the poem from Göthe that Spengler begins this work with. Now, as will become more and more apparent as we go through this series, Göthe is the most important influence on Spengler, and you can't understand Spengler without understanding Goethe's comparative morphology of plants and how Spengler applies this to human cultures and civilizations during the period that Spengler considers to be of world historical significance. So, with that being said, let's get into things now. In the endless, self-repeating, flows forevermore the same, myriad arches, springing, meeting, hold at rest the mighty frame. Streams from all things love of living, grandest star and humblest clod. All the straining, all the striving, is eternal peace in God. And so this tells us a decent bit about this work. I'm not sure. Quite an artistic way to start the work, and maybe that says as much as any of the words themselves. We can view this whole project by Spengler as a very artistic project. After rereading the introduction earlier tonight, I'm very certain that Spengler views himself as an artist, and his philosophy as a form of art. And this will tie into his views about kind of living and dead ideas, but that's something we'll have to discuss some other matters first before we can fully understand. The one other thing I'd like to mention here is kind of the importance of Goethe to Nietzsche's work, or to Spengler's work, and kind of Ian McGilchrist's interpretation of Goethe. Any of you who listened to the first installment in full would know that I'm a big fan of Ian McGilchrist. I respect him very highly. Anyway, McGilchrist views Goethe's entire artistic and scientific, or perhaps pseudo-scientific for some people, but his entire career as an intellectual and an artist as kind of a commentary on how the particular expresses the universal. So this is actually very important for Spengler as well. As you'll see from the title of the first volume of Decline of the West, it's called Form and Actuality. So the form would be kind of the universal form, if we're looking in a Platonic or Goethean sense here. And the actuality would be the instantiations of that form at any given time, basically, or any given instantiation of that form. And so I just think that's interesting, and that's all I'll say about this opening poem here. So the translator's preface by Atkinson, this is in 1926. This is when the work is finally getting into English. I'm not sure if anyone had translated it before Atkinson, but his, even almost 100 years later is the translation in English. So you can see that these ideas were spreading in German language circles for at least 8 years before, well, not at least 8 years, but potentially. Depends on if there were any other translations into English prior to this. But I doubt that they're, at least probably not a good one, because you'd think you'd have a big first mover advantage as the first translator, so maybe not. Anyway, Atkinson discusses a lot of the ways that Decline of the West has had such a huge impact on Germany in these short years since World War I. So it comes out, it sells 90,000 copies in a very short time, and this is right after World War I. And the most interesting thing to me about Atkinson's preface was that he talks about this guy, Manfred Schröter, and his book, The Dispute Over Spengler. It's actually never been translated into English, so the German pronunciation is Der Streit Spengler. So this is the dispute over Spengler. And the very interesting thing is this man, Schröter, he says there's already been more than 400 commentaries on Spengler, and this is only in 1926, or this might have even been published before Atkinson wrote his preface. So from this we can see, wow, I mean, this guy, and we've got to remember Oswald Spengler, this guy is just a history teacher at like a local high school, we can think of it. And he's actually on disability because he's got these bad migraines and stuff. And he just comes up with this brilliant work that he's actually been working on since before the World War. And it causes a sensation in German intellectual circles of the late teens and early 20s. And the final thing to mention about Atkinson's preface is that he really compliments guys who give fair criticisms of Spengler. And, Atkinson liked Spengler enough to translate thousands of, more than 1,000 pages of his work. So that makes all the sense in the world. And, I think it's a nice little preface. Anyway, moving on to Spengler's preface itself, I was impressed by this preface, rereading it, because he actually shows quite a bit of intellectual humility here. The first thing to mention is that he calls his first edition a first and incomplete edition that was necessarily an imperfect statement of these ideas. And he's actually reminding people of something he says towards the end of the introduction. And he's upset that people didn't take that as seriously. People, for whatever reason, people don't like those sorts of things. People want to believe that somebody has all the answers and that this idea is already completely fleshed out, but that's not usually the case. And the next thing that really stood out for me from the preface to the second edition was how Spengler kind of defines a thinker. Maybe not there's no other way to call it but a definition, and we'll discuss this a bit later because very shortly thereafter, Spengler is kind of denigrating the idea of defining terms and building up concepts syllogistically, things of that nature. But he says, a thinker is a person whose part is to symbolize time according to his vision and understanding. And this, in its kind of mystic way, introduces us to some pretty important concepts in Spengler's thought. First, he's very big on symbolism. Symbolism is of the utmost importance to Spengler. Second, it shows kind of this contingent nature of the thinker. The thinker is only a thinker for his time and place, given the kind of form world of his culture and the stage that his culture is in, because Spengler has this cyclical theory of cultures growing kind of strong in the spring and summer period, and then actually kind of still physically and materially being quite strong in the autumn and winter periods, but losing any sort of artistic or mainly artistic form, but even the best of its science, the best of its philosophy will be behind it in these days. And in the civilization phase, Spengler thinks only things like jurisprudence and other things of that nature would find their greatest form. So, and the next part about the thinker is that it's not a matter of inventing these concepts or even formulating it. What it is that he discovers them within himself. It is that which he does not invent, but rather discovers within himself. And this again speaks to Spengler's kind of quasi-artistic nature of this project. And he calls here, this symbolism is the one essential, the vessel and the expression of human history. So symbolism is absolutely essential to Spengler's theory of world history, or comparative morphology of world history, that will be further developed in both of these volumes. The other thing that's fascinating here is that he mentions that these things are only true for me, true for him. But he also believes they should be true for the leading minds of the coming time, not true in themselves as dissociated from the conditions imposed by blood and by history, for that is impossible. So he's got kind of a proto-postmodern approach here, where there's a high degree of relativism in Spengler's thinking, and almost to the point, basically to the point where he thinks two people from two different cultures can't understand each other on any real level. And he also thinks it's tremendously important when you're born, when in that cultural life cycle, because he views each culture as an organism. So when in that cultural life cycle are you? And the nature of the culture, which is determined by the world feeling of the culture, in his words, the fundamental idea of the culture. So for the Western culture, that's going to be the idea of infinite space and infinite force, or a point of force kind of spreading its power out in infinite space. For the classical, it's more of an idea of each body in itself, and the classical thinking revolts at the infinite, basically. And, he speaks of many other cultures. I'm not going to get into them all right now, just a couple examples. So, the next point is that he calls his project here a new outlook on history and the philosophy of destiny. So the new outlook on history, that's going to be this Goethean comparative morphology of world history that we'll get into more and more with these videos. The second part, this philosophy of destiny, it has to do with Spengler's ideas. He views destiny as a very important causal force to some degree. Now, he kind of views causation and destiny as counter concepts, this suite of Gegenbegriffe that he just loves. He's just got all these different polar counter concepts. So this one is the idea of destiny as opposed to cause, and he views history as being a matter of destiny, because whatever culture you're within, that organism is going to be at a certain point in its life cycle when you live. So your role vis-a-vis the culture is determined by your destiny in being born at that time. And that's how he views himself, that he is a philosopher of his time. And we'll get into that more pretty shortly. The other thing he says about this new outlook on history and philosophy of destiny is that it's intuitive and illustrative, not systematic and syllogistic. So the way he wants to do things is he wants to compare the different great cultures of world history. Now, the first question there is, how do you define those cultures, though? And maybe that's a question he somewhat sidesteps, because he kind of moves right into comparing these cultures that he's already reached a very unique idea about how to define these cultures, and he's defined them fairly uniquely. But he's going to compare them, and he's going to have this intuitionistic approach, but also illustrative. He's going to give you examples. He's going to give you a lot of illustrations of why he believes certain cultural phenomena are analogous or homologous or contemporaneous in his special terminology, and all these sorts of things. And now he says, those who make definitions do not know destiny. So again, we can see this deep hostility, skepticism towards systematic philosophy. Towards systematic philosophy as any sort of useful tool in historiography, in the philosophy of history, in our methodology of history. He sees it as of no use. And that's a fairly extreme position, but a very interesting position. And building up why he thinks all these things is going to be a great exercise for us. So, and that's the other thing I've got noted here is it's kind of strange that he says those who make definitions do not know destiny in one respect. In one respect, it's perfectly natural because he wants to do a physiognomic approach as opposed to a systematic approach. He wants to do an approach based on comparisons and analogies between the different cultures, the actuality that he's seeing, so that he can get to what he thinks is the form, or what he concludes, to be more charitable, what he concludes is the form of each culture and the form of world history as a broader concept than any single culture. But he doesn't think of world history as a linear process whatsoever. He views world history as only kind of existing within that single culture at any certain point of time. But it's a little bit murky how all those concepts really iron out. And again, to Spengler's credit, he leads off these prefaces by saying that his work is still incomplete and there are still internal contradictions within his work. So take that as you will. But it's just very interesting that he says, those who make definitions do not know destiny. But he's got this extensive terminology. I mean, the more we go through this book, the more you're going to see this guy's got such a unique terminology. On the one hand, you could view it very derogatively and pejoratively say, it's a cult, right? It's just cult language, because that's what cults do. They create all this jibber jabber to create false complexity so that they can manipulate people. And you look at a guy like Hegel, you look at a guy like Marx, that's exactly what they're fucking doing. Anyway, so it's just strange that he's got this hostility towards definitions, but there's no way to understand Spengler without engaging with all this terminology that he uses in unique ways, and that he defines all these counter concepts, these dichotomies, these polar dichotomies. Sometimes he doesn't even like to... He won't even let his dichotomy be split in three, even if it would be kind of obvious. And there's almost no way that this guy is viewing anything as a continuous process. Almost everything for Spengler is discrete as opposed to continuous. Phase changes. It's not something where, well, it's like, I mean, here we've got an incredibly legitimate dichotomy, sex, right? I mean, you've got like these 1 in 100,000 kind of border cases, and then people try to make them the biggest thing in the freaking world and say that it's a spectrum, but that's not. So there, the Spenglerian approach of kind of these polarized dichotomies would be perfectly appropriate. But it's hard to believe that it's going to be appropriate to every single one of these concepts that Spengler introduces. So that's my 2 cents. And then finally, he calls this approach that he's going to set forth a glimpse of life, not a definition. So again, a glimpse of life, not a definition. He wants an intuitive, illustrative, artistic approach to history. That's the key with this guy. And then he concludes with by mentioning his debt to Goethe and Nietzsche. And so he says, first, Goethe gave me method. And this is that method of comparative morphology that we've already discussed a bit. And then he says, Nietzsche gave the questioning facility. And what he also goes on to say is that whereas Nietzsche had an outlook, what he's got is an overview. So Nietzsche recognized this problem that was very counterintuitive to most European intellectuals, still very counterintuitive to this day. The idea that Socrates was actually a harbinger of very bad things to come. The idea that Socrates was a corrosive, negative influence on Greek society, from which Greek society never truly recovered, and in Spengler's view, necessarily so, by destiny, because of the point in the life cycle of the organism that he calls classical culture, or the culture that he calls an organism, the classical culture organism, and that it was just too deep into the summer or the autumn period, really now, for anything but this to happen. That's Spengler's ultimate conclusion here, but Nietzsche's the one who articulated this problem, the problem of Socrates, you could call it, the problem of this overly intellectualized form of life, probably best encapsulated in the trite and somewhat pretentious saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. A very kind of just stupid statement to some degree. I mean, I don't know. For an intellectual like a guy like me, I don't know, maybe it isn't worth living, but there's a lot of different things to live for. I don't know. These sorts of categorical statements that are just thrown out as if, yeah, for sure it's true. I mean, whatever. And then on to the third one. He mentions that Goethe is a disciple of Leibniz in his whole mode of thought. And I thought this was just an interesting little detail. He's got to mention that Goethe is a disciple of Leibniz in every mode of his thought. And Leibniz is also from Germany, or, it wasn't yet Germany, but these kind of smaller states that were German-speaking. And he was a contemporary of Isaac Newton in the traditional sense of the term, not the Spenglerian sense. And their debates about gravity and the true nature of the causes of gravity is very interesting, and I think actually sheds a lot of light on some of the difficulties of Spengler's approach. And so that's just, I'd like to mention Leibniz for that. And then the final thing he mentions here is that despite the misery and disgust of these years, I am proud to call this a German philosophy. And I didn't say that exactly as it's written, but that's really interesting. So he's setting that up by saying that Goethe is a disciple of Leibniz in his whole mode of thought. I don't know enough about Goethe's thought to know which sort of Englishman, because I've got to imagine he's thinking, there's some English speaker who has influenced Goethe greatly, and maybe that's William Shakespeare. I mean, a lot of people say I believe that Goethe really, really helped the reputation of Shakespeare 200 years after Shakespeare had died and everything, roughly. So maybe that's it. But it's just interesting. So he wants to emphasize the purity of the Germanness of his thought here in December 1922. And I find that pretty interesting. First, because in his thinking, he views it all as one culture, really. It's all Western culture on one level of his thought. But when he wants to distinguish Germany from England, or distinguish Germany from France, or basically just say that Germany's the greatest country in the world, and like we're the ones who are going to keep the culture going, and these Anglophones with their civilization and their high finance and their socialism and their this and that, and or their Darwinism. I mean, He's got some all right words to say about England and America, but they're few and far between. This is kind of a weakness of the guy. I mean, how do you posit that there's only 9 cultures that have ever really existed? They're these superorganisms, and there's no meaningful, essential difference between any Westerners. We all come from this Germanic soul. But then he's always actually trying to make Germany the exception, or make England the exception, or show how these cultures are actually different. So, what level is he actually analyzing these cultures at? That's a big weakness. And anybody who wants to look into Spengler's work and is going to say that that's just like fine, that's not a weakness at all, I look forward to hearing your explanation, but what possible explanation can you have for this equivocation in terms when culture is the central term in Spenglerian thought? There's no other way to understand it other than culture leading to civilization, and there being very few cultures. And culturogenesis or ethnogenesis, he would view those as distinct, I think, but that these... I don't know. That's a difficult point for me with Spengler's thought. Anyway, on to the next one, preface to the first edition. So he speaks, the first thing that was interesting to me here is he speaks of the double significance of the work. And this was written December 1917, so the First World War has not yet completed. But the book's not able to be published because Germany's in such a rotten state at the point. So he says the book is of a double significance. The first is he's making a philosophy of history. That's the scope and subject of the book, and that's most certainly it is. Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West is the most interesting work of historiography ever written. The most interesting work on the philosophy of history ever written. And that may tie into the fact that this guy views himself as an artist more than he views himself as a historian or a philosopher or anything else. Because that's how you're going to create living ideas. If he does something as a systematist, merely as a philosopher, it will be dead on arrival. He's got to do something living. So that's what Spengler's doing here. And the second thing he says is that it's a comment on the great epochal moment. It has a certain deeper significance as a commentary on the great epochal moment. So that's World War I. And that ties back into his idea of, being the philosophy of our time, the destiny of the philosophy, the great importance of the time and place and point in the cycle of a culture civilization and nature of the fundamental idea of that culture civilization. That's all going to dictate any real idea that comes out of that culture or civilization. And he would say the vast majority of true living ideas come out of the culture period. Virtually no living ideas come out of the civilization period. The civilization period, in his view, the culture as an organism has died at a certain point in that civilization period. Now, these are imprecise concepts. He doesn't like to define things. He just wants to make analogies and then have some conclusions from those that make him feel good, I guess. That's a real difficulty with this work. And there's just no way to get around that. So I don't care how much you like the guy. I like the guy tremendously. I wouldn't be reading and rereading this stuff if I didn't. But you cannot put this guy on a pedestal. He doesn't even do that. He does at times, but on reflection, this guy does show humility in this project. So I think that's got to be considered. He talks about the original aim of the work. That's the next thing. So it was just to predict the future of the West in light of the decline of the classical age. And you can kind of see this in the work. He really, in his conception, he really understands the Western and the classical souls, what he would call the Faustian and the Apollonian souls. And the Apollonian seems to often be misspelled here. I forget if he tried to switch it or something, but I don't think he did. I think he just took the Apollonian, and some of these editions just have a lot of typos in them. But anyway, so those are the two cultures in his framework that he really understands, because he's trying to distinguish them. His whole gripe, and we'll get into this more in the introduction when he discusses it more, are linear theories of ancient, medieval, modern. Ancient, medieval, modern. He hates that. He hates that. So what he wants is a cyclical theory of the spring, summer, autumn, winter, of when the fundamental idea of the culture is still being expressed in living ways, when we're still discovering the live implications of this idea, in his view, through art, through architecture, through every different symbolic form of this culture. Because he and Goethe, or at least in his interpretation of Goethe, because I don't know enough about Goethe to comment, conclusively on that, and I don't presume to. So, but certainly in Spengler's use of the comparative morphology, he views each plant and each culture as having an inner unity, this inner soul that is reflected in everything it does, or every symbolic form that comes out of it. Now, how do you test that hypothesis? How do you actually prove that idea? Spengler's not much concerned. Throughout this work, at many times, he mentions, all you have to do is state my hypotheses and everybody will understand that they're true, or recognize that they're true. And then in one of these prefaces, he does mention, maybe they need to understand what I've got to say to agree with it. So everyone who doesn't understand him or doesn't agree with him doesn't understand him. I've never heard that before, from every critical race theorist or other neo-Marxist. So that's an interesting point. And then finally, this philosophy of our time. Okay, so that's where he comes in on it. So he's saying that he could only be the product of this time in Germany. That's what he is. That's his artistic milieu, so to speak. And it's not one of several and merely logically justifiable philosophies. No, it's one that's to some extent a natural philosophy, he says, and dimly presaged by all of them. But it's this deeper thing. Spengler views himself as just this instantiation, this one moment in time. He's expressing the German soul. That's what he truly believes. That, in my heart, I think that's what he truly believes. I don't think he views himself as Western and Faustian at the end of the day. I think Spengler views himself as a German through and through, and I think he distinguishes Germans from Faustians. He distinguishes Germans from other Westerns when it suits him. When it suits him, he will do these things. And then, he's got the humility to at least say, yeah, there are internal contradictions in my work. And so, why don't you set about getting those out of your work? Why don't you set about on having a non-contradictory philosophy? And that kind of just smacks of Marxism. I mean, anybody who's just lying down and saying, there's a contradiction. That's a very common refuge of the Marxist sophist, because, the Marxist idea is that contradictions are inherent in everything. That's why Marxism is just riddled with contradictions. It's not that Marxism's a bad theory. Everything is riddled with internal contradictions. You yourself, in the morning, you get up, and at night, you go to bed. And, that's obviously a caricature, and I don't really want to get into that. But it's just yeah, there's some problems. I mean, he's a product of his time and his place, as he's the first guy to emphasize more and more all the time. But at the same time, he does want to make some universal claims, and I don't know. So it's the philosophy of our time, the philosophy of post-World War I Germany, this philosophy that could only develop in his time and place, that he is destined to create, and he is just a mere vessel. That's a big thing he mentions here. Only in a limited sense the property of him to whose lot it falls to parent it. Now, that's in Spenglerian, and I started the sentence halfway through because the sentence is like 50 words, but... So he's saying, this work isn't even my property in a real sense. It's not my intellectual property. I'm merely a vessel. I'm just this artist, and the thoughts just speak through me. And I mean, it's very interesting. It's very interesting. But this guy is an artist and a romantic, and he castigates Nietzsche at times as a romantic, and he'll castigate others as idealists. But I don't think he ever rises above German idealism, and I don't think he ever rises above the romantic reaction in a fundamental sense. And we'll discuss all that more and more as we go on. But yeah, so that's the prefaces of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, Der Untergang des Abendlandes. And we can see once again his artistic nature just in the title, Der Untergang des Abendlandes. So this means the setting of the sun over the western lands, over the evening lands. So it's very evocative, because Abendlandes is literally evening lands. So kind of the opposite of how Japan's the land of the rising sun, you could say. So it's very poetic. He does a lot of very interesting things, and he just loves Goethe. He wants to be like Goethe. Like, fundamentally, I think that's what we have at the end of the day here. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. He's given us the most interesting work of historiography that has ever been written, I think, and maybe that speaks to the fact that he doesn't have kind of the limits that a more rigorous historian might have, so he can do things with more flexibility that are more interesting. That's certainly an important idea we have to entertain. But on the other hand, he makes a lot of good predictions. Now, well, we'll get into all that later. Anyway, that's my summary of the prefaces to Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler, the most interesting work of historiography probably ever written, something you should acquaint yourself with, but something that you must bring a skeptical eye to. Thank you very much for your time this evening, or whenever you may be listening to this. It is my pleasure and honor to express any ideas with you, and I wish you the very best. Have a great day.